Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar series. We've been away for a while, but we hope to start with our monthly webinar series. Today, we have Dr. Muhammed Idris doing settlement and social services in the age of artificial intelligence. My name is Tina Asefa. I'm the communications director at Al-Kazaz Foundation. As you know, Al-Kazaz Foundation is a grassroots organization doing innovative services, connecting newcomers with the social service sector, with the settlement sector, and really hoping to connect them and give them that empowerment in order to integrate within our society. So without much further ado, I have Dr. Muhammed Idris with me. So Dr. Muhammed Idris is a professor at Carleton University, and in addition to being the lead developer of Compass, a mobile platform that leverages artificial intelligence to walk refugees through every step of the asylum-seeking process, Dr. Muhammed Idris is also the Perform Postdoctoral Fellow in Data Science, Preventative Health, and Child Health Policy at Concordia University in Montreal. Trained as a computational social scientist, Muhammed is also involved in the research and development of open source tools for leveraging socially generating big data and making it easy to digest this complex technical information into actionable insights. His works has been presented at numerous academic, policy, and industry conferences. Muhammed also teaches statistics at Concordia and maintains a research appointment at Harvard University, where he held a predoctoral fellowship while completing his dissertation. So please welcome Dr. Muhammed Idris.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start off by thanking the Al-Kazaz Foundation, Dr. Khalid, Kauthar, and particularly Tina, who's kind of been one of our champions on the Compass project from day one. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present some of our work in applying some cutting edge innovations in AI to settlement specifically, but also to social service delivery generally. And so in this talk, I will be providing kind of a higher level overview of the work that we've been doing within the space. But I think it very much relates to social service delivery across the spectrum. And so, yeah, I'll jump straight into it. So let me share my slides really quickly, which I'll be jumping back and forth. So again, the talk will be titled Settlement and Social Services in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And when we think about forced displacement, we tend to focus on the 65 million official refugees or the 50 million people who are at risk of being relocated due to environmental degradation, or even the 100 million internally displaced people. But the statistics are quite staggering in that about 20 people are forcibly displaced every minute. The reality is that this has implications across a variety of different contexts, even in the developed one, which we are. So for example, in 2012, we had something like 300 million people living in poverty, and these are within the developed countries. And this influx, kind of this uptick in poverty rates in developed countries could actually be linked to an influx of refugees over the past few years. And it's often the case that children and vulnerable populations are at the greatest risk of kind of living at or below this poverty line. And when we think about generally the amount of resources that it would take to achieve the UN development goals to eradicate extreme and moderate poverty globally by 2030, by most conservative estimates, this would take about $10 trillion over the next 15 years. And so you could imagine this is a growing problem. Inequality is rising across the world. And the reality is that it requires a bunch of resources, which is kind of the central theme of the work that we're doing. And this is often a challenge that is faced within by us kind of service providers, in that the sort of work that we do is labor intensive. You tend to have to hold people's hands and walk them through a particular process. And this, coupled with limited funding, puts us in a very difficult situation where we have to do more with less. And kind of a central theme to our work on Compass is that demand will always be greater than supply. And so, to stop here a second and really take a step back, one of the things that I often like to do when thinking about kind of the issue of working with displaced populations is really start off with a personal anecdote. In that, my parents themselves were refugees from Eritrea, having fled in the 1970s. And in the 1980s, actually had the opportunity of seeking asylum in the United States. And over the last year, we've been helping many people, including family members of mine, actually go through the asylum seeking process in Montreal, which has its own host of issues kind of navigating this asylum seeking process. And we've actually been working with a variety of different organizations, including the UNHCR, to develop these self-help resources for asylum seekers, but also for the organizations that actually help them navigate the process. And in particular, there are very specific challenges related to cultural and language barriers that often feel a variety of stakeholders makes them feel as if they are kind of out of control. It leaves them with a sense of insecurity. And so again, a central theme of the work that we do is that where we have a system where there are more people who need help, then there will be resources to help them. They're often stripped of their rights and their dignity. And so how might we be able to leverage new cutting edge technologies in order to kind of overcome some of those barriers? And so our work actually started off as volunteer work. And I think this is kind of another central theme of our work, in that we tend to think of technology as being this magic stick where you could solve a variety of different problems. But I think the starting place for being able to even think about how to solve these problems is actually asking the people who actually need help, and then designing solutions around that. And so that's what we did. We started off by volunteering at a local shelter, which was in many ways the front line of asylum seekers coming to Montreal. And one of the things that we noticed early on was that a lot of the things people needed help with were quite repetitive, such as finding a lawyer, scheduling a little medical exam, so on and so forth. But then the problem was that while all this information existed, it wasn't very accessible. It was in languages people didn't understand. It was often on the internet, and people only had access to the internet via their mobile devices. And so while all the resources were being allocated, they weren't really being allocated efficiently. And so I'll jump back to my slides, and start talking a little bit more about our kind of approach to this, to solving this. And it kind of rests on a central theme that we uncovered, in that when people are in very stressful situations, they often don't want more information. They often just want to be told, what do I need to do? And this actually comes from a conversation that I had with an asylum seeker in Montreal as he was going through the actual process. And so our kind of innovation, which in many ways was a first step towards identifying a broader application of AI to kind of this issue, was this idea of tailored guides. And in particular, like I said, we found that a lot of the information that people needed help with was available, it just was not actionable. And there tends to be little nuances in how people would go about navigating the system. And so we said to ourselves, well, if I know what people need help with, and I understand some very basic things about their circumstances, why couldn't we develop custom to-do lists, which provide them information on where to go, what to do, what to bring with them, what to expect. And in many ways, this is useful information, which I'll come to towards the end of the webinar. But I think more importantly, what this does is provides people the information that they need in a very actionable way, and really provides them all the resources that they need in order to help themselves throughout the process. And so in many ways, this kind of unique insight actually turned out to be quite empowering. But of course, all of this information exists somewhere, and there really wasn't a way in which we could actually share this information across organizations. And what we also recognized is that when people are going through the process, they often have the same questions. And given that the way that service delivery is currently being done is very labor intensive, whenever somebody would have a question, the answers, while known, would still take them a while to actually get. And so what we started to do is actually start collecting all of this information in a community-powered knowledge base, and in partnership with the UNHCR have started to develop what we call a chatbot. You might have heard of this term, but basically it's an automated system that allows users to ask questions, and where we have an answer which is quite relevant to that question, we can at least provide them some early indication of resources that they could look into before they actually physically speak to somebody. So while they're waiting in line, so on and so forth. And so again, where we're at is that we identified two interesting applications of ways in which we can actually help refugees help themselves through the asylum-seeking process. First, by providing kind of these custom to-do lists. And secondly, by providing this community-powered knowledge base, which can power a variety of different resources, including a frequently asked questions utility. But again, we kept coming back to this issue of all of this is very labor intensive. To put together a custom guide requires you to understand what the processes are, requires you to understand what are all of the different circumstances that might have people go through a different trajectory through this process. And to build a virtual advocate, we needed kind of a much more automated way of being able to link up questions with answers. And so this is where we start to think very deeply about what can we automate, what can't we automate, and how do we leverage kind of these cutting edge tools which have existed in industry for quite a while to kind of streamline this process. And so for us, this was the very first area where there was a very clear opportunity to start thinking about how artificial intelligence could be used for settlement services, but also social service delivery more generally. And so I think it's important, though, for us to kind of take a step back and actually think about what AI is. It tends to be, people tend to throw around buzzwords. Before it was big data and data science. Machine learning is something that often comes up again. And so maybe what I could do now is provide a little bit more of a higher level, non-technical overview of how we think about AI and how we think AI should actually be thought of within the context of social service delivery. And so let me move back to my slides very quickly. And so when we think of AI, there are kind of two general ways of thinking about it. On one hand, we have what we call general AI, which you could imagine is akin to a Terminator, or a kind of a system that can kind of think on its own, can act on its own, so on and so forth. And then what we have is what we call narrow AI, where really we are training a system in order to learn new tasks on its own, but in a very limited context. And so when we often hear artificial intelligence within within the context of social service delivery, or really kind of current applications of AI, we're really talking about machine learning. And the important part here is the learning aspect. And so how is it that we can leverage statistics in order to kind of develop these systems that can take in information in the same way we as humans take in information, right? Use those observations in order to accomplish a task outside of the realm in which it was learned. And so the easiest way to think about this is the way in which we as human beings actually go about learning. So if I want to be able to distinguish, for example, between a cat and a dog, really what I've done is over years been kind of given a variety of different examples of what is a cat, what is a dog, and using that information, I could then kind of in a brand new context say something is more like a cat or more like a dog. And so again, artificial intelligence as we kind of use it to now is kind of is what we call narrow AI, and that all it really is machine learning. And so to give a much more practical example of what this is and where it came from, we could think of spam. And so, for example, I have an email on the left-hand side, which reads, "Dear Dr. Pape, my client is looking for a Java developer. Are you ready for the next challenge? Call me," gives a phone number, "yours faithfully, XYZ." And I have another example on the right-hand side, which is saying, "Hey, Daniel, thanks for the talk at yesterday's meetup. I think I found an answer to the question we've been discussing and wanted to share, yours, XYZ." And so what we would do in terms of developing some sort of, or I should actually even take a step back in terms of us as human beings being able to distinguish between the left email, "Dear Dr. Pape," which is clearly more likely to be spam than the right, is what we're looking for is particular features within that email. So for example, it's using a much more general kind of salutation. It has a much more general kind of initial line, kind of opening sentence, which can be, applied in a variety of different contexts. And then even the call to action is kind of very general as well. And finally, as is the kind of signing off. Or on the right-hand side, it's clearly much more personal, right? Clearly, we have kind of indications that we're referring to a conversation that was previously had, and again, it's kind of there are kind of example features within it that will allow us to detect that it is less likely to be spam. And really what we're doing in order to build kind of an AI that can detect spam is feeding in a variety of these features to an algorithm or statistical model, which can then itself make predictions as to whether or not something is spam or not. And the way in which we do that is simply by providing a variety of examples of what we know to be spam to the model or the algorithm, and a variety of examples that we don't believe are spam or we know are not spam, and providing that to the model as well. And so again, really what this algorithm is doing underneath the hood is looking at features within these examples and being able to make a prediction as to whether or not it is spam. And so technically what's going on underneath the hood, and I promise this is the only technical slide, but I do think it's important to kind of have even a higher level of understanding of what is going on underneath the hood. But also I wanted to introduce a little bit of terminology here as well. And so on the left-hand side, we have what we call a training data set. And this is really kind of a variety of examples where every observation on our data set is kind of, an example would be kind of a circle, would have a particular value on, let's say, feature 1 or feature 2. Right? And so, for example, feature 1 might be how personal the email is, versus feature 2 could be what IP address or what email address the actual sender is coming from. And what we know in our training data set is which of those categories the example email would be in. For example, let's say we have an observation which has a very high value in feature 2 and a very high value in feature 1. It's likely to be a red observation, which in this case we could just say spam, versus if we have low value of feature 1 and a low value of feature 2, that's likely to be kind of a green email, which is spam. And so the training data set is examples where we know the label that we're trying to train on. And so we're using these examples to build the actual model. And once we're able to build that model, we move into the second stage, which is what we call the testing stage. And really what we have here is, again, the same feature set, right? But now what we have are regions where our model can tell us, well, if we have a specific value, let's, for say, example, a high value of feature 1 and a low value on feature 2 for a new observation, for example, the black observation, then we have a higher level of accuracy or confidence that this observation would be in the green region, and in this case would be a green observation, which we might train our model to detect. That is, let's say, for example, not spam. And in the case where we have, let's say, a low value of feature 1 and a high value of feature 2, again, where we have in the top left region of our testing kind of space, we would predict that this value, this label, would actually be, for example, in the red region, and it would be spam. And so in this case, the testing is where we're actually applying our model to unlabeled data in order to do some sort of classification or prediction. But the general idea here is that we have observations. Those observations have values on a feature set, on feature 1, 2, kind of the way in which we can leverage statistics is we can have 100 features if our model is able to identify them. And then we're going to use that to build a model which we could then unleash on in another case. And what makes it really exciting, and a lot of the kind of the advancements that people are talking about AI nowadays, even in industry, is this idea of leveraging observations to actually create the model, and actually taking the output of the model then again as inputs to a better model. And so we have kind of this positive feedback loop where the model itself, our algorithm, is actually getting smarter and smarter and smarter. So for example, thinking about spam, our inputs might be a sender's email, sender's IP address, so, recent user behavior. Again, we used examples of features where how general the email is might be a feature. And so basically when we have incoming email based off of those values on those features, we have our spam filter. So this would be our machine learning algorithm would spit out whether or not that new email is flagged as spam or not spam. But again, when we start thinking about a positive feedback loop, we don't end there. We actually are able to then collect more data where a user might check, might mark an email that was marked as spam as not being spam. Or might mark an email which is flagged as not spam as spam, or immediately deletes or blocks the sender. Again, these are useful bits of information that give us kind of more information as to whether or not that piece of information is or is not spam. And we could actually take that information again as inputs to our model, and so that we can make better and better predictions. And so how does that fit in with our kind of approach? And in particular, thinking about how we more efficiently build these custom guides, these to-do lists, but also in terms of how do we get information as efficiently from organizations into this community-powered knowledge base. And so we've thought of, and we've developed at the end of the day, this kind of fully integrated solution, where what we started off was with this mobile application, which has a variety of step-by-step guides for refugees and other newcomers. And as people are asking for help, we're actually collecting in real-time data on what people need help with. We can also connect them directly to organizations. And so for advocates, we have a solution which allows those individuals to let advocates know what they need help with and schedule appointments. But also don't forget, these are step-by-step guides. And so we actually have information on how long it takes individual users to actually accomplish certain tasks, which can be useful for tracking progress, but also in terms of asking questions directly to the organizations. And then organizations want to provide this service to kind of their users, but what we do is we give them an easy way of actually putting that information also in a community-powered knowledge base, which we could then leverage all of that information to more efficiently build guides. So identifying what types of guides do we need to build, what are the common questions people have as they're going through kind of those step-by-step processes, and again, provide that integrated solution again back to the mobile application. And so coming back, really what we're doing is identifying a very, very specific challenge that we have in service delivery, and identifying where are the bottlenecks that often seem repetitive, and how do we then leverage existing AI algorithms? We haven't really developed anything new in order to streamline that process. And so that's kind of where we're at the moment. And again, in our experience, and kind of bringing the conversation back to being a little bit more general, there are a variety of different benefits to a variety of different stakeholders. And again, I'll jump back to my slides just really quickly to explain what some of those are. Again, having this fully integrated solution allows us within 2 days to develop any guide into a checklist, but also develop kind of these self-help resources. So these are some kind of examples of screenshots of prototypes that we're developing. Again, because we've thought of ways in which to automate this process, which took us 3 weeks before, now we could do in about 2 days. But then this is where I get really excited, in that we can actually help organizations and those actually doing service delivery actually leverage their data and analytics for the first time in a very interesting way. And so I think what we need to start doing is thinking a little bit more generally about not only how many people are individually am I helping, right? But as more people are coming and I'm actually able to physically help less people, how might I be able to help more people leverage the resources that I've already invested time in developing? So we should actually be tracking information on who's using our information, leveraging our resources virtually as well. And again, we take it a step further than that, because that's not enough. We need to know, how is it that our help is actually helping people get through their process? So how useful is the information we're providing them? And as we're able to kind of collect a lot of this data, we're able to kind of identify, we can use other machine learning algorithms, which have been developed within the context of, for example, medicine, right, to identify at-risk clients, predict bottlenecks. So where we're able to identify at-risk clients, that better helps us allocate resources. And so one of the things I often hear is that, does this mean as we automate things that there will be kind of less room for social workers? No, it just means that there's more time to focus on the people who need help the most. But also identifying, predicting bottlenecks allows us to, in many ways, identify best practices as well. And so there are a variety of different use cases across service delivery, which I'll go over very quickly. Within intake, again, what we're doing is trying to help streamline scheduling of programs, addressing questions that people have, helping them filling out documents, but also for frontline workers, which is, again, an area that we're focusing a lot more in terms of helping them kind of prioritize resources, so on and so forth. And then actually within the act of service delivery and case management, kind of this ongoing development of the relationship, there will be questions, there will be recommendations that we could provide. One of the things that we recognized, actually, it's based off of data that was collected from kind of refugee claimants and newcomers in Montreal, is that there are, something like 55 to 60% of newcomers don't even know what resources they're eligible for. And so it's not enough to say, go to this website. I think it is kind of incumbent upon us to do everything in our power to kind of put them in front of the right resources. And so where I get really excited about this sort of work is in thinking about how the value that it provides to a variety of different stakeholders, in particular thinking about the effectiveness of the settlement, of thinking about the effectiveness of settlement services, as well as trying to identify kind of evidence-based methods for providing kind of better service at a more affordable rate. I also think one of the areas in which we've been able to recognize that this sort of investment is actually quite valuable is for the end users. And so we work a lot with refugee claimants, and there's a lot of research going on right now that simply suggests that that not only is a mobile device, but also kind of self-help resources a lifeline, but it's also empowering as well. right? But an area where I like to start to think a little bit more about, I think we don't spend enough time thinking about, is actually the people who are helping provide these services. And so turnover is a huge issue within the field. And a recent survey actually suggested that it's usually due to excessive workload. And social workers are often spending up to 50% of their time kind of on these mundane, repetitive tasks, which are very, very easy for a human to accomplish. And so again, when I think about kind of the role that AI can play generally, kind of within social service delivery, I like to focus on the benefits of humans versus kind of machines, right? And so us as humans, we tend to be very creative, we tend to be very empathetic, and these are things which are going to be very difficult, in my opinion, if not impossible, to kind of replicate. And so that's something to consider. And so we don't scale very well. And machines rely on electricity, right, which is becoming cheaper and cheaper. They're very good at very basic logic and are very good at multitasking. So there are a variety of different use cases, such as scheduling appointments, such as asking frequently asked questions, doing some sort of triaging, pointing, helping users or clients fill out paperwork, pointing to them to resources that are actually eligible for, that machines can do just as well, if not better, and actually do them at scale. And so again, one of the things that I've come to realize is that a lot of the funding is usually based off of some sort of political considerations, and resources tend to be focused on a particular group in a particular time. But those resources are helpful for a variety of different groups who have been going through that issue. And so kind of automating these lower level tasks go kind of a long way. And so I guess I could end off with some lessons learned. I think the first thing to think about is that don't be fooled by the magic. If it often seems too good to be true, it probably is. And so if you have kind of these big corporations who are coming at you with kind of these huge enterprise level solutions, saying that they can fix anything that you've gotten, that automation is going to solve all your problems, that simply is not the case. And so I think thinking more deeply about the issue goes a long way. And so one of the things that we recognize actually is before you jump to thinking about the use of AI, start thinking about kind of what data I have, start doing kind of an inventory of your data assets, start doing a very kind of higher level overview of your mapping out your processes, try to figure out where the bottlenecks are, because at the end of the day, it's really knowing your process, knowing what task you're trying to solve with AI, knowing what data you have access to, which is what gives you that leverage. Again, this positive feedback loop is where I believe, and I think a lot of people would agree, there is kind of a lot of potential to be unlocked. And so really automation first. And so figuring out a way in which we could streamline scheduling of appointments, for example, or assessing newcomer needs. As long as I could figure out a way in which I could be collecting that information in real time, I can make better and better AI algorithms. But the last thing I want to say is that we cannot underestimate the value of domain expertise and lived experience as we're building these tools, particularly within our sector. Every day I read news stories about how there are people who are building these algorithms who do not have domain expertise, who do not have lived experiences. And what happens is that their biases ended up getting built into kind of the algorithms and the predictions that these algorithms are making. And so I really think we should not undervalue the role that we as kind of the providers of social services play within the design and development of these solutions, which I think if we're going to do that, I think it's also really important not to kind of be afraid of learning some of this stuff. And so again, my advice would be invest as much as you can in training your current workforce to start thinking in terms of data, to start understanding what is AI, and really try to understand that beyond kind of the buzzwords. And so I'd like to actually end off with a quick anecdote, and I want to share my slide here so that we can, provide faces. This is not just work that I've been doing; it's work that I've been working on over the past year with a few friends of mine. And in particular, I wanted to give a quick shout out to my roommate and really close friend, Ahmed Saeed, who he's been the inspiration behind a lot of the work that we do. And it's actually how has helped other people navigate the system, which has really been very influential. And again, I'd like to end off with a short little anecdote where Ahmed and I's families both left Eritrea at the same time for the same reason. And they both ended up in Saudi Arabia at the same time and for the same reason. The only difference between Ahmed and I is that I had the opportunity of seeking asylum in the United States. And that has, provided me opportunities which were beyond my control. And when I think about, all that we can do to help people by leveraging the resources that already exist to give them a fresh start, I think the possibilities are endless. And so thank you. And I guess now we could open it up for questions, but really quickly, if there are kind of any questions people have or want any advice in terms of how to go about figuring out where to start or to do any of the strategic planning, feel free to shoot me an email. That's my personal email address. And then here is a link to kind of our website. And again, I'll go ahead and I'll leave that up for a few minutes as we start the Q&A. And so thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammed. This was very informative. It was very inspirational. I really love the fact how this information for the end user, for the asylum seeker, is empowering, and it gives them back the ability to make choices, the ability to make informed choices and make decisions on what needs to be done as the way they see it, because not all end users have the same problems. Not all refugees come with the same issues, although there are lots of similarities. I really love the fact how this information could be streamlined so that they feel empowered when they make these decisions. So one of the questions, you talked about the benefit of the people with the domain expertise in their input and how powerful it is and how important it is in building this algorithm. But the problem in a lot of the settlement and social service sector is that they have this lack of human technical resource to engage in high-level technology projects, right? So how do we overcome this? How do we get the information out there that they are empowered to be able to do this?
Sorry about that. So I think the first thing to recognize is that there is a lot of legwork that needs to be done in terms of understanding what the problems are and what the potential solutions might be, which go beyond kind of technically how you would do it, right? So for example, in our work, before we even started thinking about kind of automation and what tools to use and what algorithms we might be able to use, it was a very simple observation that the way in which people wanted to get help is a step-by-step instruction, right? And so I don't feel like that requires any technical skills, but that does require a lot of experience in terms of helping people, right? And so that goes a long way. That being said, I think the thing to remember is that in order for us to take advantage of all of these kind of advancements in current technologies, it's really important first for us to be able to kind of identify the problem, right? And identify kind of the bottleneck in terms of providing that solution. And it's often the case that technology will not solve that problem, right? And so that's actually a useful thing to know. So that's something to keep in mind. The second part, which is quite true, I think you need some technical expertise in order to start thinking about how do I leverage these kind of algorithms and stuff like that to start even prototyping solutions and figuring out what works and what might not work. And on this front, I think I mentioned at the end, it is worthwhile to make investments. There are a variety of open source resources, YouTube things. One of the things I like to say is that before graduate school, my first statistics class, I got a D- in. So if I can learn statistics, anybody can learn statistics. And before starting my PhD, I did not know how to write a line of code. And on Compass, I've written every line of code, right? And so there are a variety of opportunities to learn. That being said, there are two other kind of suggestions that I have is there are a variety of resources out there in terms of financial resources, for example, that will kind of allow organizations to kind of attract the talent necessary to be able to think about these sort of things. And then finally, there are a lot of people with very kind of awesome technical skill sets who are often turning on the news and trying to figure out how the hell do I contribute? Excuse my language. How do I contribute? This is something that I felt, and this is something that I felt I was uniquely positioned to contribute. And so feel free to reach out, have a hackathon, reach out to local universities and researchers, to local companies, and you'd be surprised how willing they would be in order to help you think about how to kind of get through it. But again, it always starts off with understanding what is the problem and what information do I have access to in order to be able to solve that problem. Once you have that, then try to find some technical help in order to devise some of these solutions.
So that's this is a good answer. Thinking of this from the point of view of the social services and settlement sector, one concern with big data and artificial intelligence is because they're working with vulnerable communities, and I could see that you see where this question is heading at, privacy of client information and how data is used. There's a lot of concern around that. So is it coming from legitimate fear, or is it coming from a place where it's the unknown, it's artificial intelligence, and so how do you deal with privacy issues?
Yeah, I would say that's actually one of the things that we recognized early on in the work that we were doing, right? And so we, quickly identified a problem, quickly built a solution, but in our mind, just tried to build it as quickly as possible, as in the way that we kind of thought it should be built, right? So user profiles, things like that. And we knew why we were making certain design decisions. But one mistake that we made was we didn't really have, we weren't getting feedback as we were developing it. And so when we tested the first version of it at the end of the summer, we saw two very specific things. On one hand, you had organizations who had, very real concerns about security, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. And on the second hand, we had kind of these vulnerable populations which had very real concerns about privacy. What are you doing with my data? So on and so forth. And so maybe I could give you a little bit of background as to what we think are kind of the root causes. But I think irrespective of what those root causes are, I think we need to first recognize and appreciate that these are very real concerns, and design solutions which, again, address the concerns, not necessarily trying to convince them of our approach to solving that, right? And so, for example, I think a lot of it comes down to kind of a lack of understanding of kind of technology, for example. A lot of people don't recognize that having your data in a cloud service with let's say a really big company like Google, for example, is probably much more secure than having that data on your phone, right? Is because these big organizations such as Google and stuff are investing massive amounts of money to continually maintain and update all of these security, right? And so whenever you see an update, that is usually they're finding some sort of vulnerability that they're trying to fix in real time. And to be fair, they have kind of incentives to do so. The reality is that, we are not as secure with our own information, and that's something to think about. That being said, there are a variety of different ways in which you can address some of those concerns. For example, even if I feel that Google is not going to steal my information, it could be a political concern that I might have, right? For example, my information might be stored on a server, let's say in a country where they don't have very stringent privacy rights. Well, you actually have a lot of control over where your data is actually being stored as well. So that's also something to keep in mind. And so, for example, you could actually choose the physical location of your servers. You could even choose to have all of that data hosted locally, for example, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. But also keep in mind that the more specific we get, that, you know, if you want to have, let's say, a server that's running in real time, which is 100% fully secure, kind of locally, that's going to be much more expensive, right? And so there's always a trade-off there. One of the things that we've done in order to alleviate a lot of these concerns is we don't collect any personal identifiable information. And so that's also another thing I think organizations can do. And there's actually quite a bit of leverage that we can get in terms of identifying potential bottlenecks and things like that, predicting at-risk clients with actually knowing who they are, right? A lot of these features could simply be kind of at a higher level, right? So a lot of people who were going through in this circumstance, who are going through kind of this process are likely to kind of struggle or have this question, right? And so even predicting that, we could kind of send them adequate resources. So again, I think it's partly a lack of kind of education. So again, kind of investing and trying to understand what is end-to-end encryption, so on and so forth. I think a lot of that would go a long way in terms of alleviating some of these concerns. But at the same time, I think it's actually incumbent upon us as the people who are designing these solutions to really to kind of think deeper about how we could design solutions that help as much while addressing as much as we can those concerns. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, it's very good. It was comprehensive. So, you know, it almost seems like this needs to be the logical next step, right? For this sector, for this settlement, you name it, social services, even for the asylum seekers to utilize. But what is AI good at? And what is it bad at? I mean, it's got like, so if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And is it expensive? Because a lot of these guys, their budgets are limited. So can they afford it?
For sure, for sure. So as far as what it's good at and what it's not good at, I think, going back to kind of my kind of trying to distinguish between what general AI and narrow AI is, right? And so general AI is kind of like a machine that could kind of learn on its own. We could think of that as like, fully autonomous robots, things like that. It's not, I mean, we're not there yet, right? In terms of limited AI, in terms of these repetitive tasks, right, that we can automate and we have a lot of data on, right, we can start building better and better and better kind of algorithms. And so in my mind, things like, any sort of prediction or any sort of classification would be kind of a useful kind of step. But again, to tie it to the second part of your question, which actually I think is much more important, is thinking about, is it expensive? I think it's important to recognize kind of the development of kind of the ecosystem is such that there is a lot of open source and freely available resources to actually implement a lot of these things that we're talking about, right? So for example, the same model that was used for classifying spam, right? A classification algorithm, which basically what you're doing is giving the model examples, and it's using those examples in order to classify unlabeled data. Could just, the same exact setup could be used to, if I have a question, is this question about immigration? Is this question about, healthcare? And it can be routed to the right people, right? All of that stuff is very easy to use. It's free, right? It is, there are tutorials online, right? As long as you have some very basic kind of knowledge of how to read through documentation and some very basic programming background, you should be relatively costless to implement. In terms of kind of building out an entire infrastructure, so on and so forth, yes, that could potentially be costly. And so my advice is always start small. But again, I want to emphasize again and again, the role of domain expertise is first to understand what the problem is. And if you understand what the problem is, and you know in your organization have a kind of an inventory of your data assets. For example, I would say, before you hire any data analyst or start talking to any data analyst, figure out what data I have access to, where's that coming from, how was that collected, right? Because that's going to be the first thing that is needed for us to even start thinking about where to apply AI. And that's often where it gets the most expensive, right? Is that, I need to help you even figure out what problems to solve and what problems you even have data in order to solve, right? And so if you have some very basic understanding of that, I think that will kind of lower kind of barrier to entry in terms of using these tools.
Okay, so my next question would be then, okay, I'm a settlement organization, I'm in the social service sector, I start to adopt more AI in our sector, right? How's the future going to be like? Is it because there's this big fear, AI is going to come and take away a lot of jobs, nobody's going to be able to work, it's going to be all robots, there's movies made about it, right? So, is it going to be more is it going to be more efficient services and results out of this? And what about the human element versus robotic?
Yeah, that's a great point. People like to think of AI in the extremes, right? Terminator is often something that actually took part in debate end of last year, October, November last year, about whether or not AI was the greatest existential threat. Personally, I don't think so. Kind of specific to your question about kind of the role of AI within social services, I really think it's up to us to decide, right? I think the ideal scenario is we take the lead in bringing these sort of solutions to the sector. And I think if we see that, then what we're going to see is more efficient services. We're going to see kind of being able to, what I keep coming back to is I guess in many ways is my tagline, helping more people with fewer resources, right? Being able to spend more time on the cases that actually matter, being able to avoid hopefully to zero any paperwork that needs to actually be put in. And we could focus on the human aspect, kind of this empathy that I think across any sector, across any industry, I think is probably the most important within kind of the work that we do. That being said, I really think that if we are unable to take the lead in this, and it is at the end of the day kind of larger organizations that are kind of more incentivized by profit, if we're not able to show kind of funders that we're actually providing value and how we're providing value, my fear is that people start investing in bots, right? People start investing in trying to fully automate the industry. People start thinking that, everyone is tied to a kind of electronic device now. That is a much more efficient way of allocating kind of the limited resources, public resources that we have. And so I really think it's up to us to decide. But, I think there is a chance, there is an opportunity that if we kind of take the lead in bringing it into our own sector, there is no chance we will be replaced. There will simply be, in my opinion, more opportunity to do the work that we do. But also, secondly, I think, let us not forget that there is a lot of kind of younger people like myself who are interested in technology and who are actually interested in bringing this to actually tangibly benefit people, right? And I think we could actually see a kind of a renaissance within kind of the social service sector as well. We're actually attracting kind of the top minds. My dream would be to actually teach this stuff in a social work program. And so, and every time I talk to people about the work that we're doing, there's kind of this incessant need to, how do I help? How do I help? How do I help? And so in that world, I think it's a world where we rely less on financial resources, where we spend less time trying to fill out grant applications and really develop an ecosystem where you have a variety of different stakeholders, both within the sector, but also outside of the sector, who are actually able to help kind of in the best way that they know how, right? And I think that is something that is definitely possible.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very informative, insightful, and thank you for breaking down in chunkable sections that were coherent, and hopefully it could be utilized without fear. and by empowering, like you said, the domain experts. So thank you very much, and for joining us for this session.
Thank you again so much for having me. And I just want to leave everyone else out there who's watching it live or we'll watch this after. Please feel free to reach out. If you have any questions, any concerns, where do I go to start? How do I acquire funding? If you want to bring Compass to your city, do let us know. There's a lot of excitement around kind of the project, and we need you guys in order to scale what it is that we're doing. And so again, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to working with all of you at some point.
Thank you. Perhaps share the last slide for us so we could leave it.
Yeah, okay. I can do that.